Welcome back everybody to another episode of Moto Bob Vlogs, and I'm just out today on the Royal Enfield Himalayan 450. Now this is one of the most anticipated bikes of the year, I think it's fair to say, and I've been looking forward to reviewing it as well, mainly to see if it's a significant step up from the original air-cooled 411, of which I wasn't a particularly big fan. But even after just a few miles, I can tell you that this is hugely better. And so let's take it for a spin and I'll tell you why. So look, why didn't I like the original Himalayan? I think that might be a slightly controversial opinion in some circles, because I think it's fair to say it's a bit of a cult bike. It's got a massive following, they've sold loads of them. And I do partly understand it, you know. It's affordable and I guess rugged and repairable and all those sorts of things. But I just found every time I rode it, I borrowed one as a press bike and also did a little bit of off-roading as well with a tour company down on the south coast. And I actually went on the UK launch of the Scram 411, which is pretty similar, shares a lot of the same components, the same engine and all that stuff. You know, every time I've ridden it, I just found it super underwhelming on the road. It's not particularly fast. It's about 20 horsepower from that air-cooled single. It's up near 200 kilograms, so it's not got power to weight on its side. The brakes were pretty poor. The suspension's very budget. It comes with fairly cheap tyres as well. I don't know, I wasn't really getting much enjoyment out of it. And maybe that's different if you're doing like a really long tour or something where that ruggedness is more important. Maybe it's one of those bikes you just grow to love if you spend more time with it and go through some challenging rides with it and all that sort of good stuff. But just out on the road and taking it for a spin, and somewhat on the off-road day as well, you know, I just found it slow to accelerate, slow to brake, slow to turn. There wasn't any techie features to speak of apart from the compass. But on the bike I had, that was busted anyway. And also, I didn't even find it that comfortable. I found the riding position, I don't know, like I felt like I could feel the frame rails through the saddle, so that wasn't particularly comfy, especially when you got on the edges, and the bars just maybe felt a bit too narrow or something. Then there's the build quality as well, which, you know, it just didn't feel up to scratch versus some of the competition that you could get for similar-ish money. I always felt like, you know, for example, it'd be worth saving up the extra if you can or something like that, and getting something like the KTM 390 Adventure, which just felt like a proper bike, whereas the 411 just felt very compromised in most areas. I don't know, let me know if you agree with that down in the comments below if you've ridden one. I'm sure there'll be some owners who think that that opinion is absolute hogwash, and they sort of appreciate its charms in its simplicity and affordability and its character. But I've got to say, it just wasn't a bike that was for me. And I try and review bikes, you know, objectively and think, well, who is it for? And does it meet the criteria of that potential target audience? But even then, I think there's other stuff I would have wanted to spend that same money on. But anyway, like I say, I do feel like this is a much improved bike, and it really does feel very different and much better. Even when it arrived in the studio and I, you know, hadn't even ridden it, I was already quite impressed with it. I really like things like the levers. They're quite chunky and smooth. They feel a bit like Harley levers. Nice in the hand, better switchgear. I would say the buttons still don't quite have as much feedback when you press them as I might like, but nice looking. This speedo as well, a really nice implementation of a TFT display, and very readable, a little bit of a classic style to it. There's another layout as well. And yeah, logos here, like this paint job, bit of a logo there as well. Look at these tail lights. These look like they're inspired by a GS with the integrated, let's have a look, indicators as well. Look in the middle there of the light. It's just a, you know, very nice looking thing, and especially from this sort of rear three-quarter, didn't it look cool? Like a proper adventure bike. Little slim silencer there, and blacked out engine. Bit more logo stuff, high mudguard. Bit of a fly screen. Definitely impressed with the level of finish they've achieved on this bike. And I will say, that's, you know, not massively to the detriment of the price. It really still does look like extremely good value for money. Has to be said though, all fairly superficial stuff, but on the road, it's much better. I think the power was probably the main thing that put me off the previous gen. 20 horses, when you've got it loaded up and doing the sort of things that you'd want an adventure bike to do. Like, I know it's not all about going super fast everywhere and doing, you know, ridiculous speeds, but it just felt unsatisfying to me on the throttle. Like, not enough was happening if you gave it the gas. And also, sometimes when you wanted to get a bit of a wriggle on to get onto the motorway or something like that, you know, just not enough there from a practical perspective. But this is more comparable to some of the bikes I was just talking about. So Triumph Scrambler 400 to some extent. Certainly the 390 Adventure here in the UK is a competitor, and it doesn't feel anywhere near as at a puff when you're trying to get a move on. Now I think about it, just, you know, this initial spin, and like I said, I've got a bit more to do before I can put a review together. But it seems like all the little niggles I had have been somewhat addressed. You know, suspension massively upgraded with this Showa upside down fork at the front. It feels like you got a better ride quality. The brakes, we've got bi-bray. Well, it's a single disc up front, but still feels like enough. Better braking power, more reassuring on the brakes. Comfort wise, I mean, the screen's not going to do a great deal in terms of wind protection. I assume there's a bigger one in the accessories catalogue, but the bar position's nice, tall as you'd expect, so you can stand up and it feels quite natural. But yeah, very suitable for road riding, right where you'd want them to be. If I tip the bike a bit as well and get my bum onto the edges of the saddle, it doesn't feel quite as harsh as the 411. Maybe the foam as well is a bit thicker. It doesn't feel too firm, but I think maybe that was one of the problems. It felt a bit soft to me. And then you've got these off-road style pegs with the removable rubbers, quite squishy. When I stand up especially, you got all your weight on them, but nice to have the option to pop them out. It's a little bit vibey maybe, this engine, through predominantly the pegs, even with those rubbers in, but we'll see with more riding whether that actually does become, you know, a problem over distance. But the seat and bars, I'm not really noticing it at all really. So up to 60 here from 30 in second gear. That just wasn't possible on the previous gen bike. It doesn't react like that. But I'd actually say there's just enough there on this bike to have a little bit of fun. So yeah, really looking forward to getting stuck into it. I've noticed there are a few riding modes here. So performance with ABS on the rear off, ABS on the rear on. You have to close the throttle and pull the clutch to change. And I think there's an efficiency or eco mode as well, with the option to have ABS on or off. So I'll have a little play around with those. And while it isn't, you know, the full suite of like rain, road, sport, off-road pro and all that sort of thing, realistically you don't need all that on a bike of this power level, let's say. And it's still a big step forward from the previous gen. Thing is though, I still don't feel like they've massively sacrificed the spirit of the original. It still feels like a fairly simple bike, although perhaps not quite as mechanically accessible. But yeah, it's not exactly a 1300 GS. They haven't just like doubled the price of it or anything. And it also still feels like, you know, that chugging, torquey, single-cylinder engine that's going to carry you up hills and across trails and all that kind of good stuff. And also, it still feels very off-road biased. I mean, that's the one thing I've noticed, having had the Triumph Scrambler 400X recently. That bike is more of a street bike with a little bit of off-road styling. This feels more like the real deal. And where that bike's got a 19-inch on the front, you know, you've got the big 21 on this. It feels taller. Like I say, the standing position is a bit more natural as well. That bike isn't really made for standing. And look, while there are definitely strengths to that bike, and I think it'd probably be the better on the road, this does feel tall and a little bit vague and a bit heavy on the front. If you wanted a proper adventure bike in this sort of price range, there's probably not that much that's going to do it as well as this. Even the 390 Adventure isn't, you know, massively off-road focused. That's still, I think, a bit lower than this bike. And it is a 19-inch up front, cast wheels, all that sort of thing. And the only bike I can think of at the moment, certainly on the UK market, that might run it close in terms of budget-friendly, mid-capacity, but with a proper off-road spec, might be the 450 MT from CF Moto, which I'm definitely going to try and get hold of this year for a review, because when I saw it at EICMA last year, I was really impressed. It looked every bit the sort of baby Tenere. Not quite as classically styled as this with the round headlight and, you know, a bit more of a traditional vibe to it. Definitely much more of a modern image, but yeah, really has to be considered actually now probably the chief competitor for this bike. Really enjoyed that. One of the things I was, you know, particularly focusing on there in the traffic was the clutch and gearbox. It's a light gearbox, and sometimes they can be too light. Something like a KTM sometimes feels a bit like you're not quite sure what's going on, but this is light with enough of a snick to be reassuring. And yeah, really nicely done. It's such a big improvement. I'd love to know what you think of it, so do let me know down in the comments below. Hope everybody's well, and we'll see you again in the next vlog, which I believe will be on this MT-09, and it's pretty good.